观众朋友大家好，欢迎收看红周刊面对面，我是主持人李健。在全球经济面临衰退、资本市场大幅震荡的背景下，我们今天非常荣幸地邀请到了施罗德投资集团基金经理蔡伟炜先生。那蔡总有非常多年的亚洲市场和中国市场的投资经验，相信他的见解会给我们带来很多的启发。蔡总您好，首先现在市场中非常关心的一个宏观问题就是美联储急行军式的加息是否会对经济造成一种衰退的影响。在这种背景下，您认为美联储的加息会对这种外向型的经济体带来一种怎样的风险呢？
Thanks for having me. Countries with a high percentage of exports to GDP would be negatively affected if demand in the US and Europe slows down. So far, commodity-driven economies such as Australia and Indonesia have held up better due to elevated commodity prices. This is also a reason because the supply and energy disruptions that's actually plaguing the world at this point.
所以其实听您的这个观点来说，就是这些亚洲的这些国家其实还会面临一些的这个风险。那我们就如果落到中国来说，您认为对中国的影响会有多少呢？
We think that markets in the last few months have started to anticipate an element of normalization in consumption in the medium term. The localized outbreaks of COVID in China continue to disrupt mobility, and there are still headwinds to growth in China. However, there is more hope today that the recent Shanghai lockdown represents the low point of growth in this cycle and the peak of restrictions. So we think that year-on-year comparisons are easier in the second half of this year, and a stronger rebound in activity might be possible in 2023. There remains significant value in Chinese discretionary consumption stocks in sectors where demand is actually most disrupted today, and we continue to maintain positions in the strongest industry players that are best placed to ride out the current weakness.
其实可以说，这个全球现在各个国家、各个行业和各个企业其实都是连接在一起的。有一个观点认为，我们面临的是30年以来最复杂的局势。你怎么看这个判断？现在我们的面临的大环境是什么样的？
Yeah, this year has actually been quite a tough environment for equity investors. As you mentioned before, inflation is forcing the Fed to hike rates very quickly, and this is generally not conducive for equity valuations. The market has been used to low interest rates and a deflationary environment for a long time, and this is sharply contrasting with the current scenario. And then you overlay this with the geopolitics, increasing bifurcation of supply chains, and the spending on renewable energy transition, and you get a cocktail which is very difficult and hard to predict. So the best way, in our view, to navigate such markets is to remain well diversified across sectors in quality businesses, which can best weather the economic cycle.
所以其实您的观点也是认为全球的各个行业和各个国家其实都是融合在一起的，就是没有哪一个国家能够脱离出来独善其身，可以这么理解吗？
Yes, so I think that the outlook is actually relatively uncertain for the second half, given the macro backdrop that we just talked about earlier. However, we are hopeful that parts of Asia will still benefit as their economies recover post-COVID. And we also think that there should be a stabilization of their currency versus the US dollar as the Fed slows down the pace of rate hikes. The structural growth story for Asia still remains intact. We have a rising middle class and consumption upgrade expected to be the main drivers for growth. However, we also see that near-term risks include a prolonged rise in food and energy costs that will potentially hamper consumption.
您刚才提到了这个我们的消费，所以您对于这个中国整个下半年的经济有何判断？因为消费其实是中国3驾马车其中的一驾，所以呢，下半年来看，中国经济到底能否有一个非常好的表现？
So as we mentioned earlier, I think the second half there's still some challenges which are facing China, namely mobility restrictions, as well as also the property market, which is under some pressure. However, we do think that the comps do get easier in the second half, and as we see COVID restrictions start to relax, I think that we should be able to see consumption actually rebound in China, especially from sectors that have been the most hit from mobility restrictions. For example, restaurants, travel, as well as sporting-related activities.
在中国，我们过去其实一直信奉的，或者说相信的一个趋势就是消费升级。我们看到，无论是这些高端的白酒、奢侈品、高端的汽车，他们的消费量在增长，是因为中国的消费呈现了一个升级的一个趋势。但是随着这种疫情的影响，好像现在我们看到了一些消费降级的趋势。而如果真的出现消费降级，这可能对消费整体来说其实是不利的。您看到的情况是怎么样的？
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in the near term, we have seen parts of China or parts of the consumer sector getting impacted from a consumption downgrade. We saw that also in the dairy sector. But for other sectors, for example, in beer, we actually have seen prices moving up and consumers actually consuming higher quality beer. So I think it's quite difficult to say that it's a total consumption downgrade. In the near term, there might be for some particular segments of the market. But I think in the longer term, we do see that the savings rate in China continues to be high. And there is this opportunity for Chinese to continue to premiumize the products as well as drive a consumption upgrade. So we think it's more of a short-term blip. And I think going into next year and the years ahead, we still would see the consumption upgrade story in China play out.
所以其实您的态度是短期内是受到了一些影响，但是长期来说消费升级还是在延续的。那如果我们就先关注我们目前短期遇到的风险，您觉得投资人或者以您的视角来说，在现在的这种短期内有风险的背景下，投资人应该如何保护自己，或者说您是如何保护自己的基金的净值的？
Yeah, so for us, we continue to have a fairly diversified portfolio. We call that a barbell strategy. So we have a mix of both growth as well as value names. We continue to like businesses which are high quality. We have a mixture of both defensive as well as growth names. And we think that in the longer run, a portfolio that's well diversified will continue to outperform the index.
所以您认为今年下半年亚洲市场的股市机会体现在哪些方面？
Yeah, that's a good question. Given the particularly uncertain macro backdrop, like I mentioned earlier, our portfolios are always well diversified, and we want to maintain exposure to stocks that will actually benefit from a more normalized consumption demand in China over the medium term. Over in Asia, we have positions in financials that are starting to benefit materially from the upswing in interest rates in the coming quarters. We also maintain our preferred long-term growth stocks. These are stocks that are exposed to strong secular themes in areas such as e-commerce, renewable energy, battery technology, industrial automation, and advanced semiconductors. We will use the volatility in share price to add to our preferred stocks, while staying disciplined in taking profits on companies that are trading above our fair value. So by region, we continue to see attractive opportunities in India, China, Australia, Korea, and parts of Southeast Asia.
在这些看好的板块中，我听您提到了受利息驱动的这些行业，可否给我们展开谈一谈，具体是哪些行业、哪些细分领域呢？
Yeah, so I think e-commerce, games, cloud computing, also battery technology, as well as renewable energy. All these are very interesting sectors. A lot of these companies are still based in China, so I think there still continues to be a very good investment set of opportunities overall for the China market. And then for Southeast Asia, we do have the banks which are more traditional kind of companies, but at the same time, we also have more tech companies and e-commerce platforms that have recently IPO'd. So I think they give more opportunities for investors who are looking to invest in growth names around the region.
您对于中国的这些比如说互联网公司，他们因为受到了一些反垄断的政策的要求，然后他们现在股价被打得很低，因为投资人对他们的预期很低。您对于他们的机会和前景怎么看？
Yeah, so actually we think that the internet sector in China is undergoing regulation that is actually quite similar to what's happening in the Western world. So the period of growth at all costs is probably going to be over. But on the positive side, we do think that companies are now focusing more on cost control. So this can actually help to promote improved profitability as well as sustainable growth. We do believe that these internet companies still possess good growth potential, while the valuations now are much more attractive. And given the slowdown in the Chinese economy, it actually is quite inevitable that the companies will have to restructure due to weaker demand. And this is also the same as what we see in the US and Europe. So as the economy recovers and people start to spend again, we do think that the Chinese internet companies, the valuation should start to improve, and the profitability would also start to pick up again.
您提到了中国的这些大的互联网公司可能出现重组，那在重组的过程中，对这些头部公司是一个利好吗？
I think it depends on how you view these companies. In the past, I think these companies were very interesting because of the growth potential that they had. But at the same time, we might not know which of the things that they invest in would actually start to make money. So it's a lot of hope, it's a lot of faith, and sometimes the profitability suffers in the near to midterm. However, I think now we have a much clearer path. A lot of the large internet companies are already profitable and highly cash generative. So I think we can invest in them for a different set of reasons, mainly steady and compounding growth potential, while at the same time, valuations are much more reasonable compared to before. So I would say that the companies have transformed, and I think we would invest in them for different reasons compared to before.
您觉得他们现在的这个业务本身没有什么问题吗？他们的业务依然可以保持跟过去10年一样的这种快速的增长率继续增长吗？他们的动力依然和过去10年一样充足吗？
I think it's difficult to expect that the companies grow at a breakneck speed compared to the last 10 years. It is now more difficult for these companies to acquire other companies because of the new regulations. So I think we should still expect growth in some key areas. I think e-commerce will continue to grow, games probably also, but the pace of the growth will not be the same as before. And I think that's the new normal that most investors are expecting. So it's a more disciplined environment. And in the past, maybe it was a growth at all costs strategy, where we also had issues like community group buying, where they spent a lot on customer acquisition, but were not actually making much money. So I think from this perspective, the whole ecosystem would be a lot more healthy and more focused on profitability rather than just growing the top line.
那对于阿里来说，也像您刚才提到的，它的这个网上购物的增速还是会不断的持续的。但是我们也看到社会零售总额的这个数据其实已经趋缓了，就是说明真的这个消费的空间和天花板可能已经没有之前那么高了。那这件事情对阿里来说是业务上的一个冲击吗？
Yeah. So I won't comment on specific companies, but we do see that for the e-commerce market, it's probably not growing as strong as it used to be. And for even within e-commerce, we are seeing a shift towards live streaming. So that is kind of another segment within the whole e-commerce space. So I think all these different models can survive. All these different models will still continue to take some share away from offline retailing. But at some point, there will be a kind of equilibrium that will be found. And also at this point, we do see that the e-commerce sector, just like the whole consumption environment, is being impacted by the COVID as well as just weaker consumer sentiment. So I think this is more temporary. We should actually see consumption come back as the sentiment improves and some of the restrictions are removed.
您提到他们在这些互联网巨头在开拓新的增长利润的渠道，您看到的觉得让你感到兴奋的这些渠道和这些方式，比如说有什么？可以给我们举1到2个例子吗？
So for example, for the traditional e-commerce platforms, some of them have also started shifting towards live streaming, which I think is something that China actually pioneered globally. And so this is one thing that's quite interesting. The other one maybe is community group buying, which I think is also quite a unique model in China. But even for community group buying, for example, we actually saw the companies spending a lot of money to gain customers. So it's not necessarily a very profitable exercise at this point. So that's why we also think that with the new direction that the companies are taking, profitability would actually be more value instead of just burning cash.
您认为云计算会是这些巨头未来提供利润很好的业务模式吗？
Yes, cloud is definitely very interesting. China is still in a very early stage of development compared to some of the companies in the US. But we do see the penetration for cloud increasing very rapidly. What we do need is for the government to probably start pushing and growing out the SOE segment of the market. And at the same time, I think the private sector will also follow. So the most important thing for penetration is the pricing as well as education for the customers. So if the customers think that switching over to a cloud platform in the longer run will be beneficial or more profitable for the business, I think that is when you will see the penetration really picking up.
您怎么看这个人工智能方面的这个未来的前景，以及您觉得这个领域未来会对这个公司的价值带来怎样的提升呢？
Yeah. So again, I can't really comment on actual specific companies, but I do think that on the AI front, China is definitely wants to push forward in this space. I think the government is very supportive of companies who are doing a lot of research and development in AI. So I think it really is about how the government tries to nurture as well as to encourage such companies, as well as the talent pool to grow out this segment of the market. I think at this point, there are not that many of the Chinese companies that are comparable to exactly what Google is doing, but there are definitely companies that are very innovative and trying to research into this area of the market, and definitely it's very promising.
谢谢你，伟伟。你对于这个中国整个互联网行业，虽然我们知道就是没有提到具体的公司，你也没有对具体公司做出评价，但是给了我们很多的启发。这些启发是和趋势和全球的互联网的发展是相关的，这些东西给了我们很多启发。下面想和你再聊一聊关于投资中的这些哲学问题。首先，很想请教您的一个是说，这个其实做成长股投资啊，包括对于我们刚才提到的互联网公司，对他们的投资其实都是一种成长性的投资。那做成长股投资，很多情况下需要对未来做出一个预判，但这很困难，所以很多非常成功的基金经理都时常觉得自己不够聪明，而且心怀恐惧。你在投资的过程中是怎样做的？
Yeah, I think we always need to respect the markets, and this kind of healthy fear actually helps to keep us on our toes. I think when investing, whether it's in growth stocks or any kind of companies, the most important thing is to remain humble and to keep an open mind. So normally facts and situations can change. They are very fluid, and all these can always challenge our original investment thesis as well as our assumptions. So we should try to remain adaptable, be willing to change our mind when we are presented with some new facts. And at this point in time, the bar for investing in growth stocks within this rising rate cycle is much higher. So we need to have greater conviction and certainty that a business model can really generate cash and turn profitable in the foreseeable future. instead of the company purely focusing on grabbing market share through a lot of cash burn.
能举一个曾经犯错但是马上又调整过来的例子吗？
Yeah. Again, I cannot mention any specific stocks, but I'll just give like a general ideas. We've done a lot of research into the company. We visited the company a few times as well. And at that time, we thought that it was a very good investment. But over the last 1 or 2 years, things changed. There were management changes, the economic environment changed, there was increase in competition. So even though we still like the company, and some of the original thesis still stood, but it was no longer the same company that we invested in. And at that point in time, we decided to actually cut the position. So what I'm trying to say is, it's not wrong to change your mind if the facts have changed. We should still have that conviction level whenever we invest in something, so that if the market corrects, but it's nothing to do with the company, then we might actually invest even more and increase our positions in the company. But if the fundamentals have materially changed, I think it's actually prudent to either cut your position or to question why you invested in the company in the first place.
你说的很清楚，对于现在这个整个市场来说，因为确实这个，尤其 A 股市场啊，真的已经下跌了很久了，投资人真的就是已经，从很乐观慢慢的到有点悲观的这个情绪了，所以怎么才能一直保持这种昂扬积极的心态呢？尤其在市场在低迷和熊市的这个阶段。
I think it's important to remember that all markets move in cycles, and a downturn will actually present opportunities for us to buy good businesses at attractive valuations as the froth is removed from the market. Since it's almost impossible to time the market, we think it's good to remain invested and remember why you invested in these companies in the first place. Also, I think just on a personal note, doing exercise actually helps to calm the mind, reduces the stress levels, and helps you to make better investment decisions.
你所提到的这个松弛的阶段呢，松弛的时候，我们在市场中应该干点什么？做准备吗？做研究？
Yes, I think we do research whether it's an up market or a down market. In the down market, you can actually spend more time to talk to the companies, to understand more about the companies that we are invested in. At the same time, it's also opportunity for you to buy something if you feel that the fundamental fair value of the company provides a lot of upside from the current levels. So I think even when there's a downturn, there is also opportunity.
我还想再和你聊一聊关于美联储加息以及通胀和衰退的问题，就是你觉得美联储加息会导致全球资金再流向美国，会导致亚洲和新兴市场的流动性出现一些流出的这种风险吗？
Yes, there's always this concern that as the US hikes rates, there will be an outflow of capital from emerging markets. There's always this concern, although now we have seen that the US might start to slow down the pace of the rate hikes. This time, we think in Asia it should be slightly better than before. For some of the commodity-driven economies, for example, like Indonesia, whose currency is very tied in with what the US dollar is doing. We think that the economy is in much better shape than before because commodity prices are now high, which actually benefits the economy. So they'll be able to better weather the shocks from interest rate hikes. At the same time, there are other investments, for example, like banks that actually benefit from a rate hike cycle. So these we can also invest in these companies. In general, if there is going to be a recession in the US, that also doesn't really bode well for Asia because a lot of the economies in Asia, as we talked about previously, do a lot of exports to the US. So naturally, we would hope that the US would be able to engineer a soft landing.
现在很多海外的机构都预测，美国到今年年末或者到2023年可能会出现真真实实的衰退，而不仅仅是一种技术性的衰退。你对于这件事情有担忧吗？如果美国出现衰退，是一个多大程度的风险？
Yeah, definitely there is a risk in terms of the demand from, we talked about that previously for the exporters, we've seen a slowdown in chip semiconductors. We also seen some of the companies, consumer companies in the US with rising inventories, not really able to sell their products. So this is always a risk to the whole world. And then we have some other geopolitical events that are happening, which actually are pushing up raw material prices as well as oil prices. So everything is still pretty uncertain. So I think naturally, if the US or the Europe were to head into a recession, Asia will also be affected.
你刚才提到这个现在看好亚洲和新兴市场的机会，包括印度、中国、澳洲。您觉得在印度和中国这两个人口庞大的亚洲国家之间，目前来说机会是有什么不同的表现吗？就是大家的机会是存在于不同的领域吗？
Yeah. So I think for China, we have a very strong manufacturing base, advanced manufacturing. China is a leader in some of the renewable energy space like solar, like wind. China is also very advanced in electric vehicles. And even on the industrial automation space, China is one of the world leaders. So I think all these sectors are genuinely interesting companies that we can invest in. India has a younger population. There is a stronger tilt towards the consumption. At the same time, we are seeing a lot more platform internet companies that are coming up in India. Regulation is less tight at this point compared to China. So I think the companies will be able to grow very quickly. So I think both India and China have interesting stories. We are invested in both markets, and we think that they can actually complement each other well.
如果要是从长期角度来看，那现在遇到的一个投资上的一个难点，就是你要如何去分辨它是长期的获胜的冠军，它有可能是现在的获胜的冠军，但它可能不是未来5年、10年的一个获胜的冠军。在这个过程中怎么办？
Yeah. Regulation is always a risk that we need to consider, and we also would embed the regulatory risk within our models as well as how we want to invest in the company. We don't try to preempt regulations. We don't try to think that we know better what the regulation will be in the next 5 to 10 years. So in the shorter run, we try as much as possible to focus on the fundamentals of the company. And if anything changes drastically that affects the fundamentals of the company or its ability to generate profits, then we might change our thesis on the companies.
你刚才还提到看好的这个亚洲的板块，还包括金融，这个有包括中国市场中的金融板块吗？
So we have actually invested in some of the financials across Asia. For China, it's also interesting, but if you compare the returns for the banks across the region, then China's banks actually have a slightly lower return compared to regional banks. And because we are able to invest across Asia, so we chose the companies that actually have a higher return. That is actually more a function of how we just pick companies, the best companies across different countries. So we don't really, at the same time when we manage the portfolio, we don't necessarily allocate by country. We just pick the best companies that are available across the region.
好，谢谢你，维维，你聊得非常好，非常充分了。最后给中国的投资者提点建议吧。
I think the most important thing is to remember that it's easy to follow the herd when the market is going up, But to have real conviction, you can only be tested when your investments are going down.
可以展开和我们说说，在市场不好的时候遇到的这些挑战，你是怎么应对的吗？
I think the most important thing is to remain positive. Go back to why you invested in the company in the first place. Question yourself whether the investment thesis has changed. If it hasn't, then maybe you would want to actually invest even more. But if the investment thesis has drastically changed, then maybe you need to take different course of action.